Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to our conference, The Middle Ages as a Digital Experience. My name is Juan Manuel Rubio. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Department of Medieval Studies at the Central European University. And again, we want to welcome you all to our 3-day event. Before we begin, I want to extend my thanks to the other members of the organizing team, Carolina, Evren, and Juan Bautista. Without their support and their work, this event would truly not be possible. I also want to thank the Department of Medieval Studies here at the Central European University, also for their support and for allowing us to have this space to explore the use of history and the Middle Ages in contemporary public discourse. Medievalisms on the Screen is a PhD student-led project here at the Department of Medieval Studies. This is our second conference, and we are very excited about it. We have a large range of panels covering various topics from gaming to popular representation to digital humanities. And we hope that these 3 days are going to be very both fun and interesting to all of the people who have pre-registered to our event. This is our opening keynote lecture with Kate Cook. So before we begin, some basic instructions. As you can tell, you are not able to unmute yourselves. We will give you that privilege during the Q&A session. The reason for this, of course, is to minimize the possibilities of Zoom bombing as much as possible. The lecture is going to last around 60 minutes, and the last 30 minutes of this session will be reserved for Q&A. For that part, you can either write your questions in the chat and we will read them for you, or if you want to ask your question directly, just feel free to raise your hand and we will give you the possibility to speak. Also, please keep in mind that this session is going to be recorded and we want to eventually upload it to our YouTube channel. So yeah, go to our YouTube channel where you can also check the panels from the last session, subscribe, and all these kind of things that YouTube helps the algorithm. And also, if you want information about our schedule, you can follow our Twitter page where you can find all the information. So with that out of the way, I want to introduce our first lecturer, Kate Cook. Just give me a moment, please. So Kate is currently a teaching fellow in classics at Durham University. Her research interests include language and gender in Greek tragedy and the reception of women in video games. She is co-editor of a forthcoming volume in Women in Classical Video Games with Bloomsbury, which is going to come out in September 2022, which personally I'm very excited to take a look at it because it sounds incredibly interesting. So we want to welcome Kate, and the floor is yours. So feel free to share your screen now.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the Medievalisms on Screen team for inviting me, and to all of you who've come along to start off this very exciting looking conference with me. Right, so my screen should be shared if one of the organizers can. Okay, perfect, I see some nodding. Okay, great, so I'll begin. So the video game industry is, as many of you probably know, one of the largest and fastest growing in the world. As a result, many people gain some of their earliest experiences of a historical period from video games, particularly given the widespread popularity of major historical game series, such as the Civilization series, which has been running since 1991, with at least 33 million copies sold by its 25th anniversary in 2016, or Assassin's Creed since 2007 with 140 million sold by 2019. The Total War series counts at least 36 million players, and Crusader Kings 3, a recent example of a video game set in the medieval period, so of particular interest to us here today, was reported in March this year as having sold over 2 million copies since its release in 2020. I think we will all recognize, even if we don't want to admit it, that that's quite a lot more people than are likely to be reading our monographs or our articles or our PhD theses or anything like that. So there are kind of huge audiences involved here in experiencing the historical world through these games. Adam Chapman, in his discussion of video games as a kind of history, as a sort of form of history making, has also pointed to the player's ability to engage directly and interactively with history as a crucial aspect of the appreciation for history which can be created by video games in a way which does not necessarily apply for reading or viewing media such as films. The player of video game is absorbed into the historical period. Their experience is not passive, but is active and indeed interactive. At the same time, video games can be considered in relation to ideas of cultural memory, demonstrating the ways in which they both contribute to and form a part of ideas and our kind of modern memory, as it were, of particular time periods, such as the Middle Ages. However, both the demands and expectations of historical authenticity from players and the regularly acknowledged sexism in the game industry itself means that often a particularly one-sided, indeed particularly male view of historical periods such as the Middle Ages is often presented in these games. I know that there's also been quite a lot of discussion in this field specifically of the problems of race in representation of these games, particularly with relation to the controversy around Kingdom Come Deliverance. I haven't got time to cover kind of both issues, and that's not the focus of my talk here today, but it has been really good actually to see kind of scholars in the medievalisms area pushing back against some of that problematic representation. So I'm aware of that work and I think it's really good. It's just not something we can cover here at the same time. So this talk will explore these issues with reference to video games set in the Middle Ages to consider how far the handling of women in these games gives a representative experience of the Middle Ages. It will consider questions of genre and developer priority along with player priorities in key examples of games set in the Middle Ages, particularly more recent games, so kind of trying to bring this as up to date as possible. As a result, it will consider whose experience of the Middle Ages is currently being represented by these video games and what factors are driving this representation. I should say here that I am not interested in examining the accuracy of a series of historical games in relation to the real history of women in the Middle Ages. Fortunately, much of historical game studies has actually moved beyond this approach. When you kind of start doing reception, there's quite a lot of, let's look at this film or this game and see how accurate it is, but generally fields move on, and historical game studies definitely has moved on. Not least as it turns out the prevailing concern of developers and players has often been shown to be authenticity rather than accuracy. This is matching a sort of idea of, in this case, the Middle Ages, rather than necessarily factual fidelity all the way through. And on this concept in relation to receptions of the Middle Ages in particular, the recent volume, The Middle Ages in Modern Culture by Houghton and Alverstad is particularly valuable and covers a wide range of kind of modern genres. I am also, as you may have worked out from the introduction, not a medievalist. So for this conference in particular, going through looking for accuracy in games would be not very fruitful for me. Instead, I'm going to demonstrate with some key examples what kinds of portrayals of women emerge from the intersection of ideas about games and ideas about the Middle Ages, and why there might still be some significant improvements to be made in the representation of a whole, complete Middle Ages. There are two main facets to this problem of representation, and it is, as I'm going to argue, a problem, which make this issue a particularly live one when thinking about the reception of historical periods in modern video games. The first is the games industry itself and the ideas of its developers and players. This latter group is shifting demographically. Women make up now half of all gamers, with female participation in gaming increasing with age. In 2021, Sony revealed that owners of PlayStation consoles had gone from 18% female in terms of owners of the PlayStation 1 to 41% female owners of PlayStations 4 and 5. In 2019, Nintendo were already reporting a 50-50 gender split in ownership of the Switch. Yet the position of women both as characters within games and as players and developers has been a topic of much discussion and considerable contention in recent years. In the years 2017 to 21, only 20.8% of games released featured a female protagonist. Studies have demonstrated that female characters are similarly underrepresented as secondary characters within video games. Even when female characters do appear within games, their portrayals are often limited to stereotypes and tropes, many of which are sexist in nature, as explored by the Tropes versus Women in Video Games project by Anita Sarkeesian, which itself faced enormous amounts of resistance from gamers, so-called gamers, culminating in extensive abuse being directed against Sarkeesian herself. These limitations are often connected to the problems of representation within the industry itself by commentators. A study at the University of Sheffield in 2019 found that 70% of game developers in the UK games industry were male. And currently worldwide, approximately 76% of developers are male. These numbers change slightly depending on sort of who you count under the bracket of developers, I should say, and kind of when you do these studies. But these are the most up-to-date numbers I could find for this paper. Women's presence as players or as writers and developers in the industry itself is similarly made problematic by widespread sexism and abuse, exemplified in the Gamergate movement of 2014 onwards. Recent work has also pointed to the significant problems of sexism and harassment which serve as barriers for women when they do enter the industry. Awareness of these issues, as well as of the problem itself, is growing, however. There is kind of some positive progress to set against all these quite stark numbers. Developers and players in recent years have talked more openly about the presentation of female characters in popular genres such as RPGs, and the Gamergate conflict and responses to it have brought issues of representation and inclusion to the forefront of gaming culture. In the academic field of game studies, the work of scholars such as Adrienne Shaw, Shira Chess, and Amanda Coate is exploring sexism in the industry and in its games, and arguing actively for ways that a more feminist gaming practice, both by players and by developers, could be progressed. However, this is where the second aspect of this kind of problem that I've identified comes in relation specifically to historical games. At the same time as all of this kind of industry context, there is a persistent trend across historical gaming audiences and developers to downplay the involvement and potential involvement of women in history, potential for involvement, I suppose, and therefore their involvement in historical games specifically. The presence of women in historical games, perhaps reflecting these shifts in the industry and its audience. So when women kind of are introduced into these games in response to perhaps more female players or more of this discussion that's going on in the industry, then as a result, often has led to additional outrage and complaints specifically related to historical inaccuracy or claiming to be about historical inaccuracy by players. For example, when female generals were included in a patch for the game Total War Rome 2, the review bombing undertaken on Steam included among the complaints of a political agenda, and you've got a couple of examples on your slide here, a specific complaint about rewriting history. Stop trying to rewrite history, says Calzone. Elsewhere, comments on Reddit, for example, or on the game's forums include complaints which bring up the same issue of historical accuracy, apparently, such as, why are there so many female characters in politics? It seems like a kick in the teeth to history. Or one calling the inclusion of women generals and a kind of process of making the game ideological historical fan fiction, which is a fantastic phrase. The controversy even attracted mainstream media attention, as you can see a couple of examples of on the slide, note one of which has accompanied its media attention with a very strange and problematic picture, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. And Creative Assembly were pushed to release a statement indicating that they actually had no plans to change the spawn rate of female generals despite these complaints. Incidentally, the earlier medieval iterations of Total War feature women just as princesses, marriageable female members of the ruling family, or witches, not as generals or leaders. And this is something we'll come back to a little bit later on. Elsewhere, inclusive representation has become a similarly live issue, sometimes in a kind of positive sense where it's actually flagged up by the developers and where it appears as a deliberate choice by them. For example, in the Discovery Tour for Assassin's Creed Origins, the educational product designed to accompany the game, the narrator, when the tour presents female pupils alongside male pupils in a kind of studying scene, the narrator remarked specifically that the team made the choice to show both genders attending class within the context of the game world. Even though it is historically inaccurate, the team felt that it was not necessary to prioritize historical sexism over inclusive gameplay. This comment, perhaps unsurprisingly, has attracted significant criticism from players, along with some more positive comments, and there are plenty of examples online that you can go and find just by, in fact, searching that quote, with people kind of musing about whether they agree with the prioritization or whether they want to prioritize historical sexism just for its historical sense. A surprising number think that's fine, even with the kind of loaded term of sexism that the narrator has deliberately included here. However, the Assassin's Creed games also represent a key example of the ways in which the negative industry context has contributed to problems in the representation of women in historical gaming. So they pull in kind of a lot of these wider contexts at the same time. In 2020, Jason Schreier broke a lengthy story on the sexism, harassment, and abuse rife in Ubisoft, the studio that produces these games, including accusations against some of its what he called inner circle, including creative director Serge Hascoe. The first Assassin's Creed game of the main series to feature a female playable protagonist was Syndicate, released in 2015 and set in Victorian London. And the protagonist role was split between two, so it wasn't just a female protagonist. There are these twins, Evie and Jacob, so one of whom is female. In Assassin's Creed Origins 2017, set in Hellenistic Egypt, players have the option to, or kind of can play, are supposed to play as the female character Aya for part of the game. So again, a splitting of the protagonist role. For 2018's Odyssey, there was a kind of further progress. Set in 5th century BC Greece, developers originally planned apparently to take this representation a step further and release the game with a female-only protagonist. However, they were prevented from doing so by decisions made within the studio, possibly led by creative director Serge Hascoe, who we've just met in much less pleasant circumstances, or perhaps by the marketing department. Exactly where these comments came from is not entirely clear, but apparently comments were made that a game led by a solely female protagonist would not sell. So developers were prevented from taking this step and had to provide a male and female protagonists, which players could choose between. These protagonists are Cassandra or Alexios, her brother. So they are siblings, and you choose one male version Alexios or female version Cassandra. And you stick with that for the entire game. There's no swapping between them, and there's kind of no option to play both. It's one or the other. In fact, many reviewers commented that Cassandra was actually the better choice, particularly given the quality of her voice acting. And some reviewers have even suggested that this vindicates the original intention of the developers to make Cassandra the only option for the game's protagonist. Pressure from the wider studio was, it turned out, also responsible for the sidelining of both Evie and Aya in comparison to the original roles planned for them within these games. Given that these decisions had taken place in a sustained culture of sexual harassment, assault, and discrimination at Ubisoft, it seems clear that sexism and misogyny within the games industry was at the very least correlating with a lack of full representation in the decisions made for these games, if not actively contributing to them. With this industry context in mind, it is worth noting that it is not solely games themselves which can have a significant impact on framing the types of narrative and representation which are generated in this sphere of video gaming. Paratextual materials, including publicity and materials such as box design, have long been recognized as having a significant influence on the types of narratives generated by players in their interactions with games. Studies have noted more generally, for example, the limited number of box covers which feature female characters at all, such as the kind of relatively well-known study by Burgess and Sturmer in 2007, which found 4 times as many male characters featuring on game box covers as female, and also noted the hypersexualization of those female characters who did appear. A 2017 study found that despite the changing demographics of games audiences, stereotyping in relation to gender and race continues to be a major problem on these box covers. In relation to the Middle Ages, a similar pattern seems to appear. The slide shown here, I should say, is in fact a relatively arbitrary selection of medieval games. These are most of the games that come up if you just search medieval video game. But the kind of very arbitrariness makes them a relatively useful sample. These are sort of supposedly, according to Google's algorithm, the top games that are related to medievals. Oh, except for one which is called Medieval, which is nothing to do with the medieval period and has a load of skeletons on it, which I omitted from this slide. But just so you know, for completeness, that existed, but didn't have any male or female characters on it, just skeletons. If you have a look at these covers, the imagery of kind of the Middle Ages which appears in them is a fairly common representation of a sort of medievalist view of this period of history. And kind of gives quite a clear idea of the sorts of images of particularly women's roles we're interested in here that tends to appear on these covers. A lot of these games are very focused, and the game's covers are focused on images of male military leadership, particularly in the form of the medieval knight figure or in the form of kings as well. Where women do appear, and there's a sort of collection of them on the right-hand side of the slide towards the top, they are often, although not always, in the background of male characters. As you can see, there are a couple of exceptions to this general pattern, although it's worth saying that the two at the top right, which have kind of the most forward representation of female characters on these covers, are sort of cheating because one is an expansion of the other, so these are not really two separate games. However, it's good to have kind of two rather than just one, I felt. Some of the more modern games, such as Crusader Kings 3, which you can see in small form in the very middle of this slide, also demonstrate what might be a slightly changing pattern, since earlier games in the series, such as Crusader Kings 2, just to the left of the slide, feature just a male ruler or warrior appearing alone, whereas number 3 does feature a woman, although she is, as I've noted, kind of standing rather behind the male leading figure. The other key aspect to note here will be the genre of the games considered, which I will return to a little bit later on. These wider publicity materials, not just box covers, but also the kind of general advertising for these games, can have a major impact on player perceptions and perhaps even player choices. Even where a choice to play as a female character or to represent women's lives or histories is available, sometimes the framing given the game in its publicity and marketing downplays this choice beyond just the box cover art. And I should say, actually, some of these, Mount and Blade, for example, do allow you to play as female characters, but there's no sign of that on the box cover. So sometimes even where this kind of narrative is available, it doesn't show up in the publicity. Another kind of very notable example of this trend is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Although players of this game could play as Alexios or Cassandra, publicity materials focused on the male assassin, Alexios. Both the initial trailer of the game shown at the E3 event and the official launch trailer for Odyssey featured Alexios. An additional trailer featuring Cassandra appeared at Gamescom, but this Cassandra was silent, inactive, while the trailers featuring Alexios had shown him in successful combat, emphasizing him as the kind of typical video gaming hero figure. And for more on the kind of presentation of the choice between these protagonists, Richard Cole has a chapter in the volume of mine that Juan Manuel very kindly mentioned, Women in Classical Video Games, which goes quite a lot more into the presentation of these characters in these trailers. This marketing was actually picked up and discussed, so it's quite surprising that the same pattern of marketing was then repeated when it came to the next Assassin's Creed game, the Viking-focused Valhalla, moving kind of slightly closer to your period and away from the ancient world for the moment. The first trailer for Assassin's Creed Valhalla was released in April 2020, featuring the male Eivor figure as the main character. 2 more trailers or gameplay videos were released, along with the revelation of the actor voicing male Eivor. The female voice actor had to announce herself on Instagram. Before, the first sighting of female Eivor in a gameplay overview trailer finally came in July 2020, i.e. some months later. The Eivor's Fate trailer, the first character-focused trailer for the game, released in the same month, immediately returned the focus to male Eivor. And only in August 2020 was a re-released version of the cinematic trailer available, which featured female Eivor. The first deep dive trailer in October 2020, giving a kind of detailed look at the game, took over half the trailer length before suddenly revealing that you could actually play as a female character, covering the game's story and kind of background, combat abilities, and even special items such as armor, before women as player characters were escape version of the with male Eivor in the image. And as you can see, there's plenty of box art floating around for both games, which just centers the male Eivor. This mismatch between claimed intention, i.e. that there should be equal choice between male and female player character options, and the focus of the marketing was even commented on and attracted complaints from players, as you can see on this slide. This is a relatively, I do not expect you to kind of read all of this, but it gives a kind of idea of some of the things people have been talking about. And really, they did notice the marketing of this game, Valhalla, quite kind of specifically as a mismatch with what they were saying they intended. Some commentators, probably rightly, noted that it seemed as if Ubisoft were not taking the female Eivor seriously or caring about her, as you can see kind of roughly in the middle of your slide here. And others pointed out that claiming that one character was canon while marketing the other, so claiming that the female character was kind of the canon assassin, but the male character was all over the marketing, was leading to player confusion and made one statement seem disingenuous. It is worth saying here that this kind of canon debate, I don't want to get kind of too far into it, because Cassandra does seem to have been more unproblematically described as the sort of canon intended assassin. When it comes to Eivor, there have been some claims supposedly from the developers saying that she is canon as female, and then some saying that neither is canon and that it's kind of established to be either. So the debate is useful for showing kind of audience awareness of this marketing imbalance and showing how much people picked up on the fact that they didn't feel like they were getting kind of equal exposure to the female Eivor. The question of who is canon is not so useful because doesn't seem to be a very defined answer. In the case of the Assassin's Creed series, therefore, studios' ideas, and here particularly studio marketing teams' ideas about what will sell or what is popular, prove to be a prevailing pressure on the representation of this Viking woman. Despite the fact that the game itself allows players to play as a woman throughout, thus providing an active female protagonist, relatively rare in games in general, let alone historical games, the paratext involved in marketing this game subdue that choice, likely influencing players towards picking a male protagonist, as indeed you can see one player suggesting on this slide. Or at the very least presenting to the non-playing audience, those who see advertisements and trailers but don't go on to play the game, a male-dominated view of the Viking world the game portrays to them in these kind of short displays of what it's about. It is important to note here that marketing teams are often not the same as development teams or writers. Certainly they won't be in major studios such as Ubisoft. In kind of tiny indie studios with people doing multiple jobs at once, that there may be kind of more overlap. But in studios like Ubisoft, these are going to be completely different people. So even where developers may have positive intentions around representation, studio ideas, marketing pressures about what players will expect and appreciate and what will sell in the industry context add a further problematic feature to the final products we end up with. There is another major factor beyond the kind of industry context, which has been discussed in relation to the representation of women in historical games specifically, and that is genre, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. Women's absence from historical video games as characters is often associated by scholars with the genres most popularly used for these games, such as strategy or action RPG games, as for example Wainwright has pointed out. Similarly, the focus in historical games on politics, economics, and war, as Shute puts it, has produced a particular problem for representation of women within these games. Conversely, games in genres which are traditionally thought of sometimes quite damningly, and I'd be happy to talk about this a bit more in the question and answers if anyone's interested in it, as kind of casual genres, such as the very popular Sims series of games, often do better on representation, partly due to the perception that these games have and are aiming for a larger female audience. This is therefore perhaps reflected in these Sims medieval covers shown here, in which and I should say this is kind of not a hugely historical game, but it does have this Middle Ages setting, but it doesn't deprioritize its female characters in the cover art. On both covers here, the kind of base game and the Sims Medieval Pirates and Noble expansion, we have female characters taking the foreground for both covers for at least kind of half of one of the two levels that they've got going on here. Perhaps due to the anticipated female audience for this game. The game also features interchangeable male-female protagonists, but you get a kind of much clearer impression of that from these covers than you perhaps would if you looked at the Assassin's Creed covers we were just considering. It's notable, therefore, that in some of the major recent scholarship in historical game studies, that the question of gender is only briefly mentioned, and quite often only in relation to this question of genre. I've cited a couple of people already, but there are other examples as well, where our scholarship quite often compounds the issue of lack of representation by then only focusing on discussing strategy or similar kind of what are called hardcore styles of historical games, omitting casual games from the discussion entirely, and apparently limiting the potential for further discussion of this element. To some extent, the controversy over Rome II generals does illustrate that this point about gender and genre is kind of based on a fairly good understanding of what factors are operating here. Players did not seem to object, or at least did not object very publicly, as I can't find very many objections to women existing in the Total War games. In the earlier games, as I've mentioned, the roles they were expected to play as part of the game's historical focus were secondary and familial. Women as princesses, i.e. marriageable secondary figure, or even as witch in medieval Total War games were not considered an obvious problem. It's only when women stepped into positions of military leadership as generals that players started to object vociferously. Similarly, although with less public attention, multiple complaints are available about Total War Three Kingdoms across the internet and its representation of female characters involved in military activity. Given that many games of the strategy genre focus heavily on leadership, particularly in the military context, this creates a seemingly natural barrier for active representation of women. Although, as we shall see shortly, this barrier is not in fact created solely by the genres of these games. And so I think there is kind of more to do here about this question of genre. I'm a little bit wary of some of the things I've been reading that sort of say, well, it's about the genre and then don't go any further than that. I think we should be going further than that. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this talk doing. At times, representation of women in these types of strategy games has aimed at resisting this potentially inherent bias, perhaps most visibly in the Civilization series. The Civilization series are perhaps one of the most well-known series of historical games and portray a large-scale version of history. Players take on a particular civilization, hence the title, and guide their development through time to hopefully some sort of victory, either by conquering other civilizations, through technological and scientific advancement, through successful diplomacy, or by mass spread of culture or religion. The kind of possible victories change slightly depending on which iteration of the game you're playing. The Civilization games have long been recognized as an example of a game which, as Chapman discusses, allow players to experience ideas about history and historical development through play. At the same time, they have been probably rightly criticized for some of the Western colonialist ideas they uncritically import, along with their teleological view of history. And kind of scholars and commentators have noted that by the end of a sort of civilization victory, regardless of which path you choose, you're almost always looking at a civilization which represents a kind of late stage America, perhaps quite pointedly. The Civilization games themselves have had a mixed approach to representation in relation to gender. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given its release date of 1996, the second entry in the franchise offered players the choice between a male and female leader for every civilization featured in the game. Interestingly, however, none of these female leaders were particularly strong in military campaigns, so players wishing to experience military style of play were not encouraged by the kind of gameplay elements and the drive towards victory to pick these leaders. And in fact, this idea of kind of gender as a defining aspect of players' success and experience will become a recurring theme. Other entries in the series featured one female leader for the first game, then 6 in Civ 3, 6 for Civ 4, 9 in Civ 5, and 18 in Civ 6, suggesting some sort of progress in the more modern entries. Although the interesting anomaly that Civ 2 presents, coming quite early and having this choice, makes it difficult to see a kind of a progressive narrative based on Firaxis deciding to kind of add more women to match their demographics of players or anything similar. Some of these women feature in multiple games, Boudica, for example, or Catherine of Russia. Multiple website articles have sprung up around the latest 2 entries in this series, suggesting additional female leaders who might be considered, and in the case of Civ 5, sometimes complaining about the lack thereof. In fact, in this instance, developers, as you can see on your slide, have expressly indicated a desire to include more representations of female leaders in the series. This was for the Rise and Fall expansion, but they comment explicitly, we strive to have a diverse and varied selection of leaders, and it is also very important to us to include female leaders. And then they go on to talk about the kind of underrepresentation of women in historical accounts and say that recent scholarship has revealed more and more the fascinating and powerful women that lived between the lines of history textbooks. So here, showing something which I'm going to come back to at the end of this talk in terms of what our role might be in all of this. So it's not developer activity as such that is something we might complain about. In terms of when we think about this kind of question of representation, the developers, unlike with Ubisoft, are actively seeking better representation in these games. However, in the case of the Civilization series, we can see quite clearly how player ideas about historical accuracy affect their complaints about this kind of representation, and even how these might be tied to the genre of the game considered. Upon the announcements of additional female leaders for Civ 6, there were quite often complaints of the kind seen around Rome 2, indicating that this was some kind of social justice warrior agenda or a question of political correctness, as you can see on this slide. One commentator on the Steam forums suggested that the feminists have taken over, which is my favorite response ever to finding out that there are 18 out of 54 leaders who are female. If the feminists have taken over and that's all they've managed to achieve, I'm sorry, that's not a very effective takeover in my view. As you can see, perhaps more importantly, however, both commentators here point to a historical accuracy or their perception of it as being apparently at the root of their complaint. And it's particularly interesting for our purposes here today to see that the second example, commenting actually on Civ 5, singles out medieval Europe as being the time period which they think should be represented as more sexist. They say, you'd think medieval Europe was a bastion of gender equality or even discrimination against men. despite the fact that, as you can see in the list of leaders they complain about, they are often complaining about leaders who have nothing whatsoever to do with medieval Europe. So medieval Europe and their ideas of how it should be represented is apparently sufficient to also demonstrate how Byzantine civilizations or Chinese civilizations should be represented in this game. And it should be, according to them, more sexist, more discriminatory against women. Remember, this is Civ 5, so we're still at kind of quite low levels of female leadership, actually. On the same thread, later on, not kind of on your screenshot here, one respondent pointed to the inclusion of female leaders as a marketing strategy, almost ironically, given what I've just been discussing about Assassin's Creed. In a follow-up comment, however, another poster remarked that they agreed that this choice was about marketing, but commented, "But seriously, how many women play Civ? I wouldn't have thought that a strategy game would appeal to many women, or most other types of games for that matter." Here, therefore, two factors seem to operate for the players against greater inclusion of women: the question of historical accuracy and the fact that this is a strategy game. The version or scope of historical accuracy or authenticity aimed at by the Civilization series is particularly important here. Much of what takes place in this game is not and cannot be considered historical, since the events of any civilization are shaped by the player's choices. Chapman and others have pointed to the value of these kinds of grand strategy games, therefore, as counterfactual simulations of history. Because the events are kind of changed by player choice, you don't just get a sort of narrative of what actually happened to this civilization at all. However, the fact that this game asks the player to pick one historical leader and stick with them, and kind of historical leader with scare quotes, some of these leaders are kind of tending towards the more mythological in some entries, but they're kind of presented as historical leaders, all of them. And stick with them throughout time means that this figure is supposed to be a real historical figure, bearing in mind the kind of mythological focus that I've indicated. The strategy games focus on leading the civilization at the higher level of operations, as it were, in interactions with other civilizations, for example, i.e. the sort of what we might consider the upper social strata being the primary figures who appear here, means that these figures are probably more likely to be male. At the same time, however, players' expectations of who these figures should and should not include, and particularly how many they should and should not include. Notice that the number of female leaders, despite the fact that the first commentator suggests it's not a problem after their edit, the second one is kind of, with all the female leaders, suggests that the number is a real problem for them. Mean that even the reasonable examples chosen by the developers, even when women are still in a minority, the players still reject them, apparently particularly because this is a strategy game. A very interesting comparative example emerges in the case of a game set more fully in the Middle Ages, Crusader Kings 3. The Crusader Kings series is also a grand strategy game, but is often described as a dynastic strategy game. This game covers approximately 400 years of history, beginning from 867. All of the games in this series ask the player to take on one starting leader and then play their dynasty through the generations to succeed, conquering nearby areas, building settlements, assassinating family members, or simply responding to events such as seduction attempts and diplomacy gaffes as they arise. You can just kind of sit around waiting and respond to stuff as it happens. You don't necessarily have to have much active kind of progress on your own part, but you can decide that you're going to take over the world. And some scholars have shown that kind of quite a lot of players do decide to do that. Since the game has no objectives and no real victory conditions beyond surviving, and really beyond your dynasty surviving, the first player character doesn't have to survive. It has been recognized for its flexible relationship between progress through history and playtime, in some ways allowing for a more imaginative and less constrained view of history than even the Civilization series, which do point you towards some particular goal and therefore to a kind of particular route of progress through time. This open-ended approach to history has been recognized by commentators and reviewers. For example, Luke Plunkett, in his review of the game for the magazine Kotaku, commented, "It's a game about writing your own version of history." Robert Houghton has recently praised the game for this open-ended gameplay, arguing that the lack of objectives guiding player behavior allows for the representation of historical systems and societies in a deep and considered manner. The game is also in some ways even more open-ended in its approach to historical leadership and individual prominence than the games of the Civilization series, since the leaders represented in this game become fictional within a generation or two from any start position. Some of the game's presentation of women suggests that this open-ended approach could also extend, therefore, to its portrayal of gender and of women's roles. Because of the change in leaders created by the dynastic approach, players may well end up playing as a female leader, and leadership roles elsewhere in society, including military leadership or control of their own similar realms, can, with some limits, be assigned to female characters. You can't make female Catholic bishops, for example. In fact, you quite often can't control Catholic bishops at all without changing the systems around them. Other leadership roles, however, can be assigned to female characters who emerge through the gameplay. So if you happen to have a particularly good daughter who's a general, or a particularly good aunt who's a general, has very strong military roles, you can kind of put her into that position to serve as your marshal and to go off conquering things for you. A reasonable amount of sexual agency is also demonstrated, with both men and women in the game attempting to start or starting sexual relationships, sometimes whether they are married or not. And punishments for both are possible, although certain kind of what we might call real world or real historical, cultural or faith-based additional punishments or criticisms against female adultery do continue to be in place for various cultural systems. However, interestingly, some of the Ludo narrative's framing controls, and I'm borrowing from Adam Chapman for this kind of framing language here, still create limits on the kinds of alternative stories produced, pushing the player back towards a traditional, fairly patriarchal view of women's roles in medieval history, despite this seeming illusion of freedom to change the historical narrative. That is, the game is pushed by the gameplay elements, including the setup of the game and the development through gameplay time, into a less free attitude towards gender than might perhaps be possible with a little more creative or even more unlimited play options. The game's paratexts also prioritize the male character in a leadership role. Although the box art does include a woman, as we've seen before, she stands slightly behind the male lead, and the story trailer for the game focuses on a male main character. In fact, it's the same guy as is the kind of king on this picture, and his sort of story through his first kind of life, I suppose, from cradle right the way through to death. The pressure on the player in terms of actual play experience begins from their first experience of the game in the initial tutorial. The tutorial starts with the player playing as a petty king in Ireland, and with women in the traditional place, massive scare quotes there for traditional, primarily as potential spouses, oddly, in fact, multiple spouses in the first tutorial. The Catholic faith and Irish cultural traditions established in the starting position for this tutorial encourage the player into this kind of male-centered narrative as their first experience of the game. Inheritance is by the male line, and having kind of hundreds of daughters means, as I discovered quite recently, your dynasty just doesn't survive properly, or you don't survive in it. Similarly, game mechanics and systems have a limiting factor on the degrees of freedom and agency made possible. 3 out of 30 possible start rulers are female, and 2 out of 3 of these are Catholic, meaning that their religious traditions prioritize a return to the patrilineal line from the start point of the game. Only one female starting character enables different options as a default, the Durham, and even here it is possible to create a female line of rulers, as it were, only by killing or disinheriting her existing son, and thus kind of forcing yourself onto a matrilineal line. Although it is entirely possible to create religious and cultural rules which allow for equal or matrilineal inheritance, from most starting positions of the game, these are actually very expensive options which can only be unlocked at a later stage of progress. And spending money or faith resources on these will limit the player's options elsewhere to no obvious benefit, given the military and strategic framing goals of much of the gameplay. So converting to a matriarchal religion doesn't have any benefits if one's goal is to kind of go for conquest or territorial expansion, which Houghton, among others, has shown is many players' main goal in playing this game. I should say I'm not particularly good at this game, which is probably why my dynasties don't last very well, but in a kind of few attempts to test out this system, my most recent 3 dynastic leaders ended up with about 2,000 in currency, either of cultural or religious change, by the time they died. The shifts needed to make my religion or culture even equal, let alone female-centered, would have cost at least twice that. So for most of my leaders, these shifts were not possible, and it would take quite a long time to build up the resources that I would need to change those religious rules. At the same time, the widespread presence of patriarchal approaches among neighboring society means that a female-centered approach to power and inheritance has ongoing disadvantages. And in fact, multiple players on Steam threads have commented on this difficulty, as indeed does the Reddit post I've indicated on this slide for you, which describes the experience of playing with a female leader as feeling terrible. Alliances with neighbouring societies become more complicated, for example, given the high likelihood of marrying a daughter into a house where she will no longer be the inheriting partner in the relationship. Under most faiths in the game, given this male dominance, female rulers also can't press claims against neighbouring male rulers, which is the main way of gaining a cause for war and then gaining more territory. It is notable that on the thread on your slide, in the comments which aren't visible here, multiple respondents to this person reflected that this more difficult experience was historical or historically accurate. So again, players' ideas about women's roles and lives in history are being reflected by, perhaps even shaped by, these limits. As a result, while Crusader Kings 3 does offer a great deal of freedom to play with history in some areas, perhaps even more than other strategy games such as the Civilization ones, when it comes to gender, there are apparently limits to that freedom. Counterfactual historical play apparently rarely stretches to the historical style enactment of a glorious matriarchal dynasty of priestess queens from Ireland, at least unless the player is able or willing to do additional work for that counterfactual. Or you can mod or cheat the game, and there are quite a lot of recommendations about this on Steam. I haven't got time to talk about modding as a kind of option for gameplay in this talk, but as always, do feel free to ask me about it later. These types of problems occur across the strategy game genre. As I've said, although few historical periods have a Crusader Kings style dynastic simulator with which to compare. It's not just kind of Middle Ages games. These sorts of things occur all over the place in all kinds of historical games. However, moving away from this genre does not by itself apparently solve the issue of representation for medieval women. One genre of RPG game which is particularly well represented among games set in the medieval period and much less well represented in other periods, kind of as it were, is the survival RPG. I'm not aware of any of these set in the ancient world, for example, although there are multiple examples set in a sort of indeterminate medievalist period. These games feature a character or multiple characters. Sometimes you're a kind of small community, sometimes you're an individual, who have been driven from a previous home by some disaster, such as exile, war, or quite often plague, suiting the sort of medievalist ideas, and who must therefore develop a new life and generally a new community based on their own means and by harvesting resources from their new environment. Combat is generally, although not always, limited in these games, and they tend to remain relatively small in scale across the gameplay. They're focused on the individual or a small group of families, i.e. your kind of immediate community. They don't tend to be huge, large-scale, nation-by-nation types of games on the whole. As a result, they should perhaps present an unusual opportunity to develop a new model of female representation in comparison to the games that we've just looked at, focused more on large-scale warfare or kind of public activities such as rulership. There seems to be no obvious, certainly there seems to me to be no obvious reason why some individual with no resources except their kind of physical capabilities should not, for example, be female in this setting, or why a burgeoning brand new community based on gathering, hunting and farming should not provide active roles for women to play. As is well known, when we look at kind of social history and we move our focus away from the aristocracy, this is quite often when women's lives come into focus in scholarship, since activities are less likely to be so strongly gendered when it's not possible to afford, for example, one half of a couple staying at home full time, and when some of these kind of public-private divisions start breaking down a little. As a result, I fully expected this to be an area in which moving my focus away from the ancient world to games set in the Middle Ages might give me an exciting new positive case study to talk to you about. However, this opportunity does not seem to be taken up. One of the most recent and popular games in this genre is Medieval Dynasty, released in September 2021 with early access to the game beginning in 2020. The protagonist for this game can unfortunately only be male. This is despite the fact that he is primarily represented on screen as a shadow and a pair of hands, as it's a game in first-person view. So production of character models and so on is pretty limited. You don't have to worry about doing different hairstyles or anything like that. You're just doing hands. There are some moments in this game where the narrative about women seems potentially nuanced, representing an improvement on another major game in this genre, Reign of Kings, which has a lot more combat in it and appears to feature no female characters at all. In Medieval Dynasty, women do appear as part of the background in the kind of various villages you settle nearby. We are told that the player character's mother has been a key figure in his life and has taught him various practical skills, including hunting, although she has been killed off in order to set up the game narrative, which is a kind of problematic trope we see a lot of. There is at least one female character in another village and another in the player character's backstory, which he kind of explores, who are supposedly expert hunters, although the latter also ends up as the main object of a love story narrated by men and featuring the trauma of baby loss, kind of pushing her almost unnecessarily into a more female romantic role associated with pregnancy and this kind of strange love triangle which develops. The vast majority of player interaction with NPC women presents a less varied picture. The majority of women met on quests are associated with domestic tasks such as cooking or creating clothing, and their fetch quests involve helping them collect the materials they need for these tasks. Although, as I've said, there are a couple of hunters, so that's, some progress. The most active interaction had with female characters, however, when they start appearing in the ludonarrative aspects of the game rather than the framing narrative. That is, when they are part of the narrative the player generates for themselves in playing the game, represents a much more insidious dynamic. One of the objectives of the game is to found a community rather than just prioritize individual survival. In order to do this, the player can talk to traveling individuals who just sit around by the fire all day and have no home or occupation in existing villages and persuade them to join their new community. It seems like quite a good life. I don't know why you join this community and start working, but never mind. You can, apparently. The first time the player speaks to a female member of this group, this information tab provides details of flirting and informs the player that one of their goals for the game will be to find a wife and have an heir to found the titular dynasty of the game. This goal actually becomes a formal objective of the game in the final quest, which has the text, "In the life of every man, the family should come first. It's time to find a wife and ensure the continuation of my dynasty." The specific objectives given to the player are have a wife, have an heir, and then gain some renown for your dynasty by completing other quests. Women become marriageable via repeated dialogue options under flirting, which often throws up some other interesting ideas about gender roles as seen here. This woman has a very kind of, knight in shining armor, kind of itself a sort of nice medievalist trope about romance to work with. And via gifts, both of which will raise the affection level, which you can see there is not very high with this woman at the moment, if they are successful. Once the affection level reaches 100, the woman will agree to a marriage proposal. And once married, you can also then propose the production of an heir to continue the dynasty as the quest requires. There is no sense via this dynamic that the player could ever be eventually unsuccessful in romancing a particular woman. You can have kind of sometimes a flirting line doesn't work, particularly if you choose a stupid one, but you just come back the next day and try another one, and you can move forward again. And once you get to 100, they will always say yes to marriage. Through this dynamic, therefore, women become a collectible resource, an objective and an object for the player. They are represented as having about as much agency as the sticks collected to build the first quest as to build your first house as one of your first objectives, or animals killed for meat. They have no input into the game or the narrative beyond receiving the player's input of flirting dialogue or gifts. The narrative's framing goals, that is their status in relation to the objective, push women therefore primarily into the position of object for the player and prevent their taking a more active role as subjects of their own narratives, despite the potential for female subjectivity in this kind of, start from nothing narrative. Even outside the problems created by the genres and priorities of strategy games, therefore, there are clear limits placed even in modern games on the representation of women. Finally, I'd like to look quickly at one other game which took a bold turn away from some of these problems, and it again represents kind of quite a different genre of game in some ways, particularly for historical games, and that is the now very famous Plague Tale: Innocence. A Plague Tale is set in France during the 100 Years' War, and as an action-adventure stealth game has a more established story than some of those discussed above. The narrative is established by the game and by the kind of how the developers have written it, rather than solely by the player's choices. So you are kind of much more constrained in terms of what sort of story is going to throw up. Despite the box art, which actually seems to center and put in the foreground the young boy Hugo here, and despite the genre, which normally doesn't necessarily prioritize female characters, the protagonist of this game is female, Amicia de Rune. She is good with a sling, smart, and stealthy, all qualities the player will need given her attempts to protect her brother from the French Inquisition and a horrendous horde of rats, which you can see on the cover there, throughout the game. Other female characters also feature prominently and in active roles even when they are NPCs. A young female thief who also has a brother, for example, or Amicia and Hugo's mother, who turns out to be an expert researcher. Amicia herself proved such a popular character that she was awarded a Pegasus Award by the Academy of Video Game Arts and Techniques, or technically the game was awarded one for best character, but I like to think, she won it herself. The game's stealth focus also means that extremes of physical strength are not generally required, which rules out one reason why female characters are often kind of deprioritized. And its close focus on Amicia and Hugo and the small cast of individuals who they meet removes the strategy game's focus on leadership. As just a young person who happens to be caught up in the historical events around her, no one can reasonably object to the historical authenticity of Amicia being a female protagonist. At the same time, the game's focus on children as its main characters means that the usual alternative problem faced by female game characters in and out of historical games, that of hypersexualization, is also fortunately not a problem. Amicia is also introduced as a strong, enjoyably ambitious figure. Her first line, spoken to her father in a cutscene where they are out in the forest together before you start kind of playing the tutorial, is when he suggests following the lords. "Is that your only ambition for me, to follow? I will beat them and I will watch them eat my dust as I forge ahead," implying that her own expectations are much greater. And indeed, in a nice twist of fate, the player's experience of Amicia will be precisely that. She leads, while Hugo, the young brother, follows, often holding her hand. There is therefore a lot of really positive progress here, demonstrating, at least from a developer's side of the equation, how a setting in the Middle Ages can absolutely lead to female positive representation within video games. However, I am afraid that I am still not totally satisfied with the representation we see here. Again, I'm particularly interested in players' responses to Amicia, as showing some of the limitations of gamers' expectations and how they are framing the kinds of characters created. Unlike with the female leaders of civilization, there's quite a lot of praise from players for various sites for Amicia. But often it drifts into demonstrating how Amicia succeeds in their eyes because she meets various female stereotypes. One discussion, for example, praises her for not being a strong woman, and that's exactly the quote, and particularly praises that she is maternal due to her care for her brother. Other comments on this thread also picked up on the maternal aspect and particularly appreciated that as she grew up, she became more maternal. So there's a kind of progression from young girl into mother, a suitable aging approach, apparently, for female characters. Still more comments comment positively on her appearance, demonstrating that even female child characters are actually subject to the male gaze when they appear in this media. You do get, particularly in YouTube videos, you do get other commentators pointing out Amicia is young, but it doesn't seem to be sufficient to put people off. And quite a lot of these discussions kind of almost fudge her age. There's quite a lot of comparing her to famous actresses who are in their kind of late 20s, early 30s, and saying how she looks like them. So there's a kind of aging up before objectification going on in a lot of the comments. The tendency towards stereotypical presentation isn't actually limited to our protagonist. Beatrice, of course, is a mother and appears kind of primarily in that role. And she will also be vanished, presumed dead for much of the game, moving her into the role played by the medieval dynasty mother, and in fact, quite a lot of other mothers in historical games who tend to be either dead or vanished, including mothers of Rice, Son of Rome, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Expeditions Rome, and kind of plenty more. I also earlier described Beatrice as a researcher. In fact, she is an alchemist, as Amicia will also turn out to be. And it turns out later in the game that Beatrice's research focuses on a supernatural power belonging to her son, Hugo. Beatrice thus creeps worryingly close to appearing as a witch, one of the few accepted stereotypical roles for women in modern Middle Ages media. Even the gameplay, which kind of nominally provides the excuses I mentioned earlier for the female protagonist, are we back on? I just had a thing about being muted. Yeah, okay. Even the gameplay, which nominally provides the excuses I mentioned earlier for the female protagonist, in doing so creates a circumscribed view of female agency and activity. Amicia is literally limited by the maternal role she performs, and as a result, so is the player. You move at times frustratingly slowly when holding Hugo's hand. Here is a nice, here is a nice picture of Amicia and Hugo walking along holding hands. This game is, by the way, very gorgeous. I would recommend it if you kind of like looking at pretty things. There is some running about and some opportunity to go away from Hugo, but most of the time, if you leave him too far behind, he makes a noise, attracts danger, and you die. Sometimes he clings with his arms around Amicia's waist, which is one of the most annoying ways of trying to make forward progress I have ever experienced in a game. And I've played all the BioWare RPGs where they keep injuring the protagonist and you have to kind of limp around as part of a scene. This is actually slightly more annoying. The stealth dynamic too is also one which has been associated by some game scholars' accounts as female activity, as a kind of particularly feminized form of female activity. And in Plague Tale, it's associated with being otherwise unable to cross and access a particularly male world. The dangers met, apart from the rats, which are horrendous, are primarily male soldiers and villagers. Coming across these dangers openly, given that Amicia cannot really fight, means immediate death for the player character, creating the impression of a male-dominated world in which the female protagonist cannot directly operate, a limiting condition. Finally, the game's framing narrative also contains elements which devalue Amicia herself, despite her position as a protagonist. Very early on, Amicia's role is established as being to protect and guide Hugo, hence all the hand-holding. And it will turn out, I apologize for the mild spoilers coming in this sentence, that this is because Hugo has a supernatural power related to controlling the rats. If you don't like rats, I would not recommend this game. There's a lot of stuff about rats in it. As such, Amicia falls into the helper maiden trope, often given to women across a range of genres and in fact across a range of media. She is important because of her relationship to and activity on behalf of a male character, not on her own behalf. This is also, of course, apparently Beatrice's main purpose in life, and accounts for a strained relationship between her and her daughter at the start of the game, unnecessarily ruining the narrative potential for a female-female relationship here, which could have been not focused on a male character. The enemies from the Inquisition who surround the pair have instructions to capture Hugo, but to kill Amicia. She is expendable, he is valuable. There are other enemies that will kill Hugo, so the death ratio is kind of imbalanced. It's not sort of totally one-sided, but nonetheless, this kind of emphasis on his value is frustrating. And in fact, the experience of playing the game re-emphasizes this idea of her being expendable, since you can end up experiencing Amicia dying a lot if you mess up on the stealth puzzles, not speaking from experience. So A Plague Tale, in a sense, despite being a rather different genre to those often found as popular historical games, suggests that there are ways to present women with prominent active roles in these historical games. Simultaneously, however, it demonstrates the ways in which even this success seems to be contingent once again on player expectations of stereotypes and limitations to female agency and importance. Now, I'm aware that we're kind of running out of time very rapidly, so I will conclude here. This is, of course, only a very brief look at this potentially enormous topic. We could talk more about ratios of NPCs to protagonists, wider aspects of marketing, player choices, as well as player comments. So which of these kind of male-female protagonists are they playing? And plenty of topics I've only briefly gestured at, such as sexualization, intersection of race and gender as providing further problematic questions for representation, and so on. What I've hopefully shown this afternoon is that there is something, this morning, there is something to discuss here. And I think something more to discuss than some of the kind of 3 or 4 line sentences in major historical studies recently might have us believe, something that goes beyond genre. Across multiple genres of games and multiple facets of games, the view given of the Middle Ages is male dominated and falls prey to stereotypes which particularly serve to limit the representations of women. As I noted at the start of this talk, in historical games, the intersection of many of these facets is what causes, in my view, the particular problems of this topic. This is why I think it's not just that we could be discussing this issue, but also that we should, and that we should keep doing so. Given these enormous audiences and the role of games in establishing kind of cultural memory, in this case, a memory about the Middle Ages, and given the kind of intersection here with the sort of gamer culture on one side and these ideas about historical authenticity, there's absolutely potential for amplifying exclusive and kind of problematic attitudes about women. We are doing, and as indeed Firex's show, they are seeing a lot of scholarship kind of highlighting that these are not the only roles that women had, and these are kind of not the only ways of portraying women. But in my view, we need to be kind of pushing that even further, trying to make sure that some of this scholarship, particularly the kind of social history that's been really expanding in the last 20 years or so, is getting into these games and engaging with this question and taking it beyond just saying, well, it's just about the genre, or indeed saying it's just about gamer culture. There's quite a lot of things going on here that we could get stuck into to try and kind of build a better and a different view of the Middle Ages in these games. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this very interesting lecture. Now we're going to move into the Q&A. So we would like to ask the audience, either if you have questions, to raise your hands with the reactions that you have the option here on Zoom, or to write down your questions in the chat in case you would want us to read your question for you. Maybe to get the conversation going, I'm going to abuse my privileges as the chair of the lecture, and I'm going to ask the first question. I mean, I have several of them really, but I'll begin with one that really caught my attention very strongly. And is this decision by Ubisoft in the case of Assassin's Creed Origins, what you mentioned, this relation between historical sexism versus inclusive gameplay. I find that incredibly interesting because to some extent, it gives me the impression that it establishes a new form of relation between games and history, right? We know that there were, for example, in the case of Rome 2 that you mentioned, that there were military leaders who were female. And I don't know, think about the ones that we don't know because we simply don't have the sources. However, we are also very much aware that sexism has been very much present in patriarchal societies, right? And sometimes when we focus as historians on the issue of accuracy, because of the very nature of our sources, sometimes this is difficult to avoid. But I found this decision of weighting historical sexism with inclusive gameplay very interesting. So I would like to know your opinion about that, and if you could elaborate a little bit about this, because again, it gives me the impression that a new way of thinking the relation between history and games.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I think to some extent, I always feel like it could be, or it could have been, a new relationship. I think the statement that kind of Ubisoft made there was really interesting and really quite strong. I'm not sure it's always borne out in everything else they do. So I think there was kind of quite a lot of almost lost potential here. But I mean, personally, I think that there are plenty of things in relation to historical accuracy that we don't import into games and don't expect to be imported into games because we prioritize gameplay. I mean, for example, you can play Plague Tale for kind of plenty and plenty of time, and neither you nor Hugo is going to need to go to the toilet at any point. I mean, that's just kind of a really basic, obvious thing, but we're not saying we want every aspect of these historical periods imported. We're really happy to kind of sacrifice plenty of those. And if you play, you know, a Total War Medieval, the kind of warfare style is going to be based at least partly on what is enjoyable and what you expect from a Total War game. So there are plenty of places where we and developers are happy to make sacrifices, as it were, to kind of ignore aspects of accuracy in order to set up this kind of new relationship between gameplay and history. And I would like to see gender and kind of ideas about sexism being one of them. I'm not sure it is at the moment. I think quite often we're still getting a lot of importing of historical sexism, and even worse, quite a lot of importing of modern sexism to make the issue even more imbalanced than it needs to be. One game that I will mention, or kind of one series of game that does quite interestingly with this, is the Expeditions series. So there's a few of these. The most recent one is Expeditions Rome. And in these games, you can play as a female character. And unlike in the Assassin's Creed games, playing as a female character actually makes a difference as well. So there is some kind of importing of historical sexism in the sense that sometimes characters will say, for example, well, you can't get involved in the war, you're a woman, which is actually deeply frustrating as a kind of player being told that, well, I just started this game, you said I could select a woman, why can't I do that? Actually, they've struck a really interesting balance between importing this sexism for flavor, but not letting it affect the gameplay experience, because it will turn out you actually can be completely involved in the war. Sometimes people will kind of make comments, so you do get a bit of an experience of kind of being female in Roman society, and there's kind of pressure at one point to get married in the kind of games narrative to kind of, in order to be able to hold an inheritance. So some of this stuff is imported as a kind of interesting historical point, but without limiting gameplay factors or kind of your experience of female agency. And that, I think, is a really interesting way of striking this balance, and something I'd quite like to see more games kind of trying to engage with.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We already have one question in the chat, and we have 3 people raising the hand. So we're going to do it one from the chat, one from the people raising the hand, then one from the chat, and in this way, okay? So Francis, I think you're already unmuted, so please go on.
Hold on, I'm just checking getting the sound a little better so I can hear. Okay, no, I found it an interesting talk to listen to in general because there were things I found interesting. For one thing, the major issue is one of agency that you seem to be addressing is female characters have to have it is what is the type of agency is allowed to them, which is an interesting question in its own right. I find the question of what type of agency is expected is interesting. I don't know much about these games. I should have had my son come in. He would have told me much more. But I also found something very indicative about it is the very term, the use female. It's not women. It's not, and the term feminine doesn't exist in the sense that the very roles that are expected in society are what those roles should be expected in society, which, by the way, when you're dealing with the Middle Ages, is far more complex than people would let you believe. It's interesting that the female implies that they're in fact everybody has the same roles and does the same things. You just happen to have different genders, you're different sexes, actually, to use a really physical term. You're either male or female, but you're doing the same thing. And that, whereas various values of attitude, which I'm not saying that they're good or bad, don't exist, and I find that interesting. I would just watch yesterday Bright Star by Jane Campion, and she tells Keats' story, but from the story of from the perspective of a woman, which makes things very interesting in the way and how that because it is feminine, it's not specifically female, and I find that problematic in its own right. But those are the two great things. The hypersexuality is, of course, turns women into objects, which I think is an obvious problem, which I think is being addressed, and which you have just addressed. I think, but I mean, even by those who are writing the games or making the games are beginning to realize there's a bit of a problem there, and because again, attitudes towards sex and towards how the Middle Ages depict sex and how we depict sex with the Middle Ages is an interesting problem in its own right. But anyhow, that's basically, I can see how the various interlocking problems come in. Just more comments than questions I make, actually, as I go along.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I obviously, as a non-medievalist, I am not really qualified to comment on kind of ideas about the feminine in medieval culture, so I'm definitely steering well away from that. I will say that I suspect sometimes use of kind of female characters particularly creeps into my language, because quite a lot of the things I've been discussing here, so most of the characters I've been talking about in this game are human. Actually, quite a lot of these kind of qualifications apply to supernatural female characters in games as well. And kind of as someone who works on the ancient world, I tend to spend quite a lot of time talking about those too. So I think that might be partly a reflection of my own sort of, as it were, historical background, the period I'm more focused on, because we're quite often talking about, you know, the roles of goddesses or the roles of monsters and so on as well, and seeing how those fit into some of these ideas. So we're not necessarily sort of just talking about humans, despite, in fact, that's kind of in some ways quite an interesting difference to thinking about some of these medieval games, is at least apart from sort of witches, which are still women. I mean, most of the time, in most of the not that. Sorry, that was not to say that some witches are not human. That was to say, in terms of game presentation, they are mostly presented as kind of human figures, often presented as human figures. So I suspect that is having some influence here, and it would be quite interesting. I mean, again, you know, there are so many things I couldn't cover, but perhaps that kind of, you know, supernatural female versus mortal female versus, I suppose, woman aspect is another thing that kind of could be brought out here more fully in some of these comments on these games.
Okay, thank you. Madeline asks on the chat, do you think the marketing committees for video games are responsible for making historical accuracy disclaimers more forefront? I don't know if the question is clear like that, or...
Yeah, do you mean historical accuracy disclaimers as in claiming that they're not aiming for it, or do you mean the reverse?
Maybe we can ask Madeline to unmute so she can elaborate on her question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, actually the first, if video game companies need to, you know, more blatantly say, This game is not meant to be historically accurate. It's more on the, the genre end, or like, fantasy-esque medievalism. Because once they start, putting forward, oh yes, we've done all this research and, it's a historically accurate game to some extent, then that's probably where a lot of these communities get really upset. But they're like, well, that's not historically accurate. And, you say it's a historically accurate game, and then they throw things in like this. I personally maybe don't agree with that, but I just wanted to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I would like that to be true. That is, that kind of players are being led into believing there is a level of historical accuracy that is not met, and that's what's upsetting them. I have some reservations, and this is partly because, again, actually coming from the ancient world context, even where games are kind of explicitly set in a mythological period, you get quite a lot of these complaints about representation of women. So, for example, the most recent, the Total War Troy version that came out is based off the Iliad. So it is in a kind of quasi-historical period, but it is very closely connected to the Iliad. The narrator appears as kind of a sort of Homer figure. So they set up this setting as being kind of from a poem, from a piece of literary fiction, as it were, even with a kind of historical period setting to go with it. And even in this kind of fictional area, quite a lot of players were really upset that the first DLC introduced Amazons. They were really unhappy about the kind of female warriors, the female generals. Again, they complained about it being historically inaccurate, even though Amazons are a part of the Iliad and may well be kind of historically accurate figures themselves for a kind of given version of a given value of accurate. I mean, there certainly are historical stories of Amazons, and some people have kind of attempted to attach them to kind of Scythian female warrior communities and so on. So even with all of this background, and even in a fictionalized kind of setting, still these complaints about historical accuracy come out. I do think sometimes marketing a game based on authenticity is creating problems that are kind of amplifying this, absolutely, as well. So I think my answer is kind of both yes and no. A similar game, kind of Phoenix Immortals Rising, I can never remember the order of those words in the title, I'm afraid, but another Ubisoft game based completely on myth. They were selling as being really accurate to the myth, but then simultaneously in the same interviews admitting that this is based on a poem which no longer exists. So I don't know what they were calling this, but they really were pushing the accuracy angle, despite the fact that I'm not sure what they were saying they were accurate to in this context. And I do think that kind of can amplify these problems when people are treating authenticity or accuracy as some kind of saleable quality. But I also think the kind of ideas about accuracy that players have are not necessarily actual accuracy. So I'm not sure changing the marketing would do enough to help here, as it were. So yes and no. Sorry, that's a really kind of unhelpful answer to that question.
Thank you, Kate, for your answer. James, I'm going to deactivate your... Okay, there you go.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I sort of had two small but big questions. One of which is, I guess, just to push you a bit more on, like, what you feel a sort of ideal scape of games looks like here. And we've had a bit of discussion from one's question on, whether, there are roles for, bits of medieval gender representation to turn up in games, or whether we should be aiming for just much more it doesn't matter what gender you pick, this is a sort of almost purely aesthetic feature of the game sort of end state. So I'd be interested a bit more of your thoughts on that. And I guess the other thing I wanted to ask is whether you think that there needs to be some level of rethinking of how masculinity is done in some of these games, conversely, to help shift and reshape that balance. So be interested in your thoughts on both those points. Thank you.
Yeah. So your first question is enormous. I think I would like, ideally, if I were in charge of all historical games created, the first place I'd go actually is more variety. I would like to see games in which sometimes there is an Amicia, but sometimes there's a figure who is kind of strong and not having to hold her little brother's hand all the time. And, you know, when you play Civ, there are as many female leaders as male leaders. And in, you know, some games there is a lot of female kind of warriors, and in some there's less. And I just feel personally that at the moment we are looking at quite a kind of circumscribed picture for female characters, and the first thing I would like to see is a lot more of all of this. I do think I've just mentioned it already, and this is because I'm currently supposed to be writing a paper on it, but the Expedition series does provide quite an interesting example of how you could do this better, because as I've said, you can play as a female character, but at the same time it feels a little bit like a female character. Because people comment on it. What I'm not sure is necessarily an improvement in terms of representation is the Assassin's Creed approach, where you end up with a woman who is not a woman almost. So Cassandra is kind of nominally a woman in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but at one point you're kind of entering the Olympics and no one ever says, hang on a minute, the part that you're female should be bothering us. I mean, in my view, it would just take a moment. And what I don't want, and this kind of ties back a little bit into Francis's question actually, I don't necessarily want that to circumscribe player agency, that kind of thing, but I would like to see it kind of recognized. So I'm not sure the kind of gender as just cosmetic is necessarily, in terms of representation, improvement. I think there could be more of that as well, because, you know, more of everything would help sort of shift the whole landscape a little bit. But I would like it to come alongside examples where some of these things are kind of more brought out, and, you know, maybe some sort of games where women's actual medieval lives are being represented as well. I do not know enough about what that might mean, but, you know, in terms of the ancient world, you know, women being represented as being involved in religion and kind of getting player agency engaged in that, for example, is one area where I think kind of it's a sort of ignored aspect of women's lives and roles that could be expanded. And I'm sure there are sort of medieval examples of the same sort of thing where these women are operating and they're currently not really appearing at all. So more of everything in my ideal world. And your second question about masculinity, yes, absolutely. There is some good work, particularly on kind of masculinity, I think particularly in relation to RPGs and kind of how games shape a very sort of, again, sort of traditional view of masculinity in a really not very helpful way. And seeing that pushed against, again, particularly in historical games, would not hurt, as another way of kind of opening up this field a lot more, and you know, bringing in more of the kind of, at the moment, just because my focus today has been on women, this has been a kind of very binary talk, but it would be better to see a lot more of those binaries kind of expanded and adjusted and reconsidered as well as part of gameplay. So more of all of the options as well, so more masculinity in different forms as well would be a good improvement, I think.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions coming in, and running out of time, so we will try to do this a little bit faster. Then Jordan asks, from where do you think this perception of women in the Middle Ages derives? To what extent do you think the repetition of these perceptions in various media about the Middle Ages creates the audience's understanding of historical accuracy?
I think you're kind of pointing to various media is absolutely a good answer here. There are, when you kind of talk to audiences or when you survey audiences about ideas of historical accuracy or authenticity in games, a lot of them point to other media they've seen as a kind of comparison and say, well, I know this is not true because in that film they did, or indeed I know, particularly in kind of World War II games, there's been a lot of work on the fact that if you reproduce a narrative from a film which may not be kind of historically accurate, it feels right enough because of their experience of the film that audiences will absolutely say, yes, it feels authentic to me because of this kind of media work. So I think there's a lot to kind of look at in terms of kind of transmedial interpretations of games, looking at where they're getting some of these ideas. And there is well, showing where some of these ideas are coming from other media. So I think a lot of it is coming from kind of wider media. So if we're going to kind of change the scope of games, then we may, as scholars, also have to change, you know, TV and film and everything as well, and kind of push some of their representations too.
Thank you. Now, Josh, I'm going to ask you to also unmute yourself. Let me give.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks, Kate. This was fascinating. I have a couple of questions related to player agency, not within the game, but in relation to the industry. Because early on you mentioned the debates over what's considered canon. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what kind of investment there is on the player side in what the game companies consider canon. I was a little bit surprised to hear how heated those debates seem to get. And then later you mentioned the modding that takes place. And it sounds fascinating. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the kind of modding that's happening in terms of who are the communities that take part in this and how do they describe themselves and their activities? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, I'm just going to try and pull it back. I don't know if you can see it, but as some of these comments kind of pull out, the idea about kind of what is canon for some of these games, for some of them, it doesn't seem to matter, but for some of them, particularly RPGs, audiences do get quite het up about what is and isn't canon, and particularly they don't like feeling like an ending they chose or a character they chose is not canon, for reasons I don't entirely understand, because I would have thought kind of the freedom to pick your own ending, certainly personally it's never bothered me, but it does seem to bother quite large groups of these kind of communities. So some of the comments on complaining about the kind of marketing of Cassandra and of Eivor complained that they had kind of played the game and as a male character and then discovered that the female protagonist was being called canon by some people, and that upset them because they felt like they weren't playing it right. So there is a kind of an interesting area. For example, I mean, the very last comment has got some kind of foul language in it, but complains that, you know, the characters that got attached to in the game is imaginary at the bottom left of the slide, because of the kind of their experience of the game not necessarily matching what the game, and in this case, in fact, hasn't declared as canon, but what they're hearing the game is declared as canon. So that is something that people get kind of unhappy about. They do seem to like a kind of a narrative that fits their narrative, if there's going to be a narrative at all. And actually, we do see this sometimes in historical games. A desire to fit the kind of canon historical narrative is expressed by some players as well. So some players of kind of things like Crusader Kings will try and map out a kind of quasi-historical, you know, this is the real history of England, so I'm going to play it out, and that kind of thing, which is quite interesting. Oh, I'm afraid I've forgotten what your other question was.
It was just about the modding that takes place.
Oh, yes,
so how do these communities define themselves and their activities?
Yeah, so I'm conscious of the time, so this is going to be a very oversimplistic answer. There is a lot of modding around some of these games. Crusader Kings is one of them. Games that kind of allow for flexibility in modding, you see kind of a lot of it. Since the advent of Steam, because Steam kind of shipped with this Steam Workshop system, which is supposed to help make modding easier, both in terms of the creators making the mods and in terms of players accessing them, there's been even more of this. In relation to who does it, there is a really good book, and I'm afraid I haven't got the reference written down, but if you email me, I could send it to you. There is a very good book on kind of almost sort of marginalized communities, so queer communities, but also kind of female gamers and so on, and how they have been modding games to make them fit their experience better, to make them kind of more representative in their view, which is really interesting. So there is absolutely some of that. There is also modding in precisely the opposite direction. So there are a lot of mods for removing female generals from Total Rome 2, for example, or for kind of doing other things. Interestingly, there are mods on Crusader Kings that will allow you to take away some of the limitations that I mentioned if you're playing female leaders. So it kind of goes both ways, but modders are kind of happy to adjust all sorts of aspects of these games. And, you know, there's an awful lot of cosmetic style modding as well, to change the appearance of games, but some of it is kind of more gameplay oriented too. Sorry, that is an enormously oversimplified answer, but hopefully it kind of gives some response.
Thank you. I mean, if I may, I would like to, if you could also send me the reference to that book, I would also be super interested in taking a look at it. We have one final question by Rob, so please feel free to.
Brilliant. Thanks. Well, first of all, thanks, Kate. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to your forthcoming book. That sounds brilliant. Just very quickly then, to build on what you were talking about with James, and to a certain extent throughout the talk, and this is the issue whether it's better to have equality or better to explore difference. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight with some of the Assassin's Creed games where you can pick which gender you're going to be, but ultimately you're playing a male storyline, or playing a male experience. I was going to highlight Expeditions Vikings, but you preempted me on that. But what I was going to ask, I suppose there's this tension between agency and experience. So Expeditions Vikings, it still lets you have all this agency. It still tries to teeter you towards a bit of an experience about playing. There are differences between genders, but ultimately you can do whatever you like. I wonder how much of a problem do you think it is if that bleeds over into game mechanics? So I know you've talked about Crusader Kings, how you can play as a female character, but it's basically putting it onto hard mode. And so you can have the exact same stats as if you're a male character, but you'll be treated differently. The game will tend to punish you for choosing to be female, choosing to try and play for a female line. How much of that is a problem? At what point does it become okay to sacrifice some agency to highlight differences in experience? Is there any way in which that could be better balanced within Crusader Kings? So can the game be orientated a bit more towards a female experience, to a female style of rulership, perhaps? Something along those lines. I've phrased that appallingly and I apologise.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because instinctively as a player, and I know that's kind of, I sometimes find the kind of the balance between the sort of observational style of scholarship that we do in our other areas and the kind of experience of games that we have as players, it can get quite complicated in game studies. So as a player, I would say that I quite want any kind of limits on agency to be cosmetic only. I don't necessarily want to be playing the game differently just because I've chosen to play a female character, because that's frustrating as an experience. That, that's the kind of, I've focused quite a lot in this talk on limits, and limits on gameplay quickly start impacting enjoyment. Having said that, some of the games I've looked at, and particularly the game I looked at for this this book we've got coming out, was a strange mobile game, which is effectively a kind of romance novel mobile game. But what I was really interested in is that the player agency is kind of quite circumscribed by the fact that you're just following this narrative through. So actually you haven't got that much agency. But the question of the character's agency is made a really live discussion all the way through, partly because she's female. And so kind of what she does and doesn't have access to. You play as a courtesan, so it's been kind of set up as an attempt to make you kind of a female character with as much agency as possible. But people keep talking about it. They keep talking about the fact that, other female characters don't have the same agency. And they kind of raise this issue. And as I say, this is what I probably, although I was briefly frustrated by people complaining about me being a woman in Expeditions Rome, actually I appreciated the raising of the issue. So, and I suppose also, if there were more variety, just to go back to kind of one of my other answers, if you could play, Amicia, but also another game where you're Amicia, but you don't have to sneak around all the time, then I would actually be much happier with the fact that Amicia's kind of, probably Amicia's movement being limited is quite representative. So I would feel kind of better about that, because I could then also just go and play my game where I'm Amicia, but I kind of run everywhere and have a great time. While there isn't that, I am wary of the gameplay association of being female as being limiting. I think that is likely to do more harm than good, particularly among players' attitudes to female representation. So until we get to this kind of utopian stage where there are women everywhere in all the games that some Civ commentators think we've already reached, and I don't think we've quite reached, I think we have to be a little bit careful here about player experience, perhaps. But if we were to get to that utopia, then kind of representation of actual women's limits might be quite a valuable gameplay experience, just so long as it wasn't the only gameplay experience.
That's absolutely fair enough. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you everyone for your questions, and with that we close the first session of our conference. So again, I want personally, in behalf of everyone, to thank Kate for her lecture. It was very, very interesting and very insightful. Before we close the session, We would like to remind all of you that our next panel will take place at 2 p.m. So we have time to go and grab lunch. Although the schedule says that it's until 3:30, we'll go until 4 because it's our longest panel in the conference. We want also to remind all of you that we have a Topia space. All the instructions are in the email that we sent you in the last few days, in order to continue the conversation or to talk with other people participating in the conference. So with that having been said, we expect to see you all in the next panel. Again, Kate, thank you for your lecture, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
James is asking if there's specific times for the Topia space. No, it's open all the time. It's just for free access. You can join there at any moment. I will have to repeat that in the next one. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.